Hello, Matthew. Welcome back.
Hello, Louie. Welcome back to you too. Is this a starting? Is this it?
I would say so.
Go on then. What are we going to talk about?
I'm hoping people like these little quippy bits that we do.
Yes, this polished opening each time.
Yeah. What were we talking about last time? I can't remember.
Beyond caring. I don't know. Probably the same old.
Same old. Well, what are you? Are there any burning issues that you know?
Well, not any burning issues. However, the context there. So each time I'm speaking, I think you're always in the same place.
I'm always in the same place.
We're chatting.
Metaphorically,
I'm out and about doing things. Well, again, whereas I'm out there searching for an answer. Yeah. No, I'm at work today, so I'm in a teaching room at the university, and this afternoon I'm going to be involved in a module, a course that we call Exceptional Human Experience.
Ooh.
And the focus of that particular session is on something called the overview effect. Now, is that something you're familiar with, Louis?
I can't say I do know about it.
So the overview effect, in essence, and I'm hoping I'm describing this appropriately, it's a term that's being used to describe an experience that many astronauts will report when they go into space, and then they look back at the Earth and they see the whole Earth there, or at least much of it. But if those astronauts have been to the moon and so on, and you're able to, I'm not sure where the actual context is, but you get a sense that they look back at the Earth, they see it, and they get a so-called sense of an overview of the whole place. And often they come back reporting experiences that having seen the Earth in that way, they're transformed by it. It's effectively something which is akin to a spiritual experience that they then lead their lives very differently, or allow themselves to recognize that we are one humanity on this small planet, and this idea of divisions between countries and so on is somewhat arbitrary. And the other aspect of it that kind of appeals to me, it's a bit like, I think it's Carl Sagan, will talk about the pale blue dot. In fact, when you look even from, I think maybe it was Voyager, the Voyager probe, when it was very, very far past, I want to say Saturn, then it's actually turned the Voyager, I think he has to turn the camera back and look back at Earth, and you've got this tiny pale blue dot showing that the Earth is actually this tiny, almost insignificant, small piece of dust in this vast galaxy. And I think when he talks about it, recognizing again that all of humanity that's ever existed has been on that pale blue dot. And to me, I often see that as quite a useful way of keeping things in perspective when we get a little bit, what's the word, anxious or het up about whatever's happening in our life. That actually, if you remember pale blue dot, that if you keep things in perspective, then maybe we're worrying too much about the little things in our lives. So that's where my head is at the moment. I'm hoping that the teaching session will be one where we encourage students to think about what this overview effect may be. Are there ways in which we can approximate it without going into space? So often when people go on an aeroplane, look out the window and start to sort of see large swathes of land beneath them, or even on a high mountain, you look out to see a large view, that you get a bit of a sense of your own place within the world. So that's something we're going to look at today.
I mean, I'm reminded of just before I had my my existential, break when I quit parapsychology. I'm kind of reminded of some of the research which says that people that take hallucinogenic drugs equate those experiences with some of the most, they're some of the most important experiences of their life, because they change their perspective on existence. And I actually took some Hawaiian baby wood rose seeds. Now, they have a small quantity of what is basically a lysergic acid compound in them. Mm-hmm. And I had an experience where I saw the world, and this was images inside my head, so they were just thoughts facilitated somewhat by the compound. And I saw the world, and I saw humanity as ants roaming around the world, and I kind of saw the insignificance of our existence in the sphere of the planet, and the ants just roaming around and doing their thing very purposefully, but ultimately, what is it to see an ant doing work? And that was definitely part of the reason. I look at that experience as being a beginning of this change in perspective that I went through over a few, you know, culminating in me quitting parapsychology and becoming, say, existentially aware. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. And I think what these things have in common is that there's something about when you know, for me, pale blue dot kind of phrase that captures this idea of that if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, any one individual life is, I'll use the word insignificant in that context. Now, I think the other interpretation is, or even if that is the case, we're still faced with this is a question I keep going back to. How does that impact our lives? Because someone could say, well, in which case, my life is insignificant from that perspective. It doesn't matter what I do. And that's, you know, the everything is pointless thing is that, well, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter whether I live or die. Whatever I do won't change the course of events. It won't make things anything more meaningful or purposeful. It doesn't really matter. And that for some people could be one where you go, okay, then, well, what's the point in carrying on? But for most of us, we don't do that. We either try to find some sense of purpose, or from the overview effect perspective, people don't come back saying, oh, I've looked back at the Earth and I've realized basically, you know, this is just one planet in a vast, you know, darkness. What's the point of doing anything? The experience is one which is more so-called spiritual or transformational, where they come back and lead more, let's use the term, meaningful lives. Or they understand things better. They have a better understanding of how things are than they might have done beforehand. So some of this is a question over when one has those kinds of experiences where you see things from a new perspective and you go, okay, I now get my place in the bigger picture, and either I'm just a very small grain of sand worth nothing, or I see it as being I'm a small yet important cog or part of a bigger picture. Is how it impacts your decisions then of your daily life. What's worth doing? And that's one I think it's worth exploring, whether you see it as being, oh, well, I'm just an ant amongst many hundreds of thousands of ants, if not millions of ants, doing my little bit, or am I kind of an important part of the bigger picture?
I mean, the only thing I'm going to say is I don't necessarily think recognizing your insignificance in the universe. I mean, Copernicus says, you know, Copernicus showed us that the sun was not revolving around us. We are not the center of the universe. And, you know, I'm at heart a Copernican. We are not the center of the universe. But for each one of us, our existence is perhaps the most important thing. You know, I don't give a shit if the world continues when I die. I mean, what kind of ego would it be to care about what happens when you don't exist? I mean, I don't know. And the fact of the matter is, of course, what happens when I'm alive, my existence, questions of existence are very important. I think even if you are a Copernican and think that the world doesn't revolve around you. So I think that, I mean, these are questions that we're exploring. You know, like I say, I have my take and you have your take. And I mean, they are interesting.
Well, and that's what I mean. But is almost in that last sentence? Does that capture where we're going with this? Is it this idea they're going, yeah, so we're exploring these ideas, and you're gonna have your take, I've got my take. Oh, it's interesting. Let's just keep going. Or do we feel as though there is in this pointless universe that you articulate for us, Louie? Do we sense there is a point to what we're doing here, even if the point is simply we are passing some of our days chatting about stuff? For some people, may want to listen in. It may help them a little bit. It may not. Deal with this existential experience of being alive and making decisions and so on, or are we trying to do something where, oh, is my perspective this, and can I, let's say, convince you of that, but can I get you to think of it this way? Are you going to make me think of it this way? I'm just trying to again capture, what are we doing? Why are we even prioritizing our time now by talking about this stuff as opposed to doing something else?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, and I always come back to this imagery of, say, you know, we are huddled around a fire, the camaraderie of two existential beings or two or more existential beings, you know, surrounded by the abyss, surrounded by annihilation, surrounded by ignorance and non-meaning, you know, there is some comfort, there is some, you know, we are Jesus carrying the cross, and you are helping to hold that cross for just a little tiny bit. The burden is shared, and there is some relief, or, you know, misery loves company. And, you know, for me, I like to, you know, to share these ideas and say to people who perhaps, you know, and I know that some of the people listening to this are living in cultures, living in societies where these ideas are completely foreign. You know, questioning these things is completely foreign, and I'm saying it's not necessarily something wrong with you to question everything. And I think that, you know, the questions that you're having about what do you do in a day-to-day, you know, I mean, again, these are legitimate questions. Whether they have an answer, that is I mean, do you need to have validation from the universe? Does the universe need to sign off on why you get out of bed in the morning, or are you going to be happy with the decision at the end of it, conclusion that you get out of bed because this is what you prioritize, and you're happy with that answer?
Well, on the latter point, I think it's because we recognise that I think there is a so-called answer at individual level, that the so-called right thing to do is, the preferred option is to do something which, I'm going to use terms then that may be the right or wrong terms, that you're passionate about, that you feel is important, that has some sense of meaning to oneself, and that's what your priority should be. At the same time, there's plenty of other pressures or constraints or forces or whatever you want to do, social forces, that make that hard to do. So the people who are leading those lives, when they're saying, I'm leading a really brilliant creative life and I'm producing all these things and it feels so fulfilling, and whether it has a point or not, because in the end, the earth will fall into the sun and everything will implode. Well, at least in terms of my experience of my life, is one which I'm leading to the full. And that's something which appeals to me, because even if you see it all as purely passing time, which I think was the title of my very first blog post, was this realization as, well, if you're born, then you die. Everything else is just passing time. Even if you see it from that perspective, then you have to fill that time with something which gives you some sense of reward, meaning, purpose, enjoyment. And many of us don't do that.
I mean, I think we will discuss further in these podcasts, because, you know, I want to discuss things about, you know, ethics, morality, love, you know, and for me, these things don't necessarily exist. So I think the problem is that falling back on them as reasons for doing I mean, I have no problem with you doing what you want. It does seem silly having a very short existence. It seems silly doing what you don't want to do. I mean, that seems ludicrous. It seems silly flagellating yourself every minute of the time you exist and then dying. I mean, that seems silly too. But you know, I do understand that there are people who, you know, want justifications, want a reason to you know, to do good or to do the things that they find interesting. And so again, you know, I'm not saying you're wrong.
So let me pick up there. So what kind of caught my attention was the word silly. So it's kind of my sort of silly sense of humor. Goes, oh, it's, you know, we describe it being silly, and then of course it links to the word absurd. So at some level, if you're saying, well, the universe is absurd and doing any of the things is somewhat absurd, it isn't. Is there a choice of doing something which isn't silly, which isn't absurd?
Well, from my perspective, I think that, you know, everything we do is absurd. And I mean, this is like Hitchhiker's Guide again. I mean, I remember when they used the infinite improbability drive and they come out of using it, and the computer says anything that, you know, we've come out of infinite improbability, anything that you can't cope with now, that's your problem, you know, it's nothing to do with the drive. And, you know, I think that's how I feel about existence. I think, you know, any semblance of normality that you feel, I think you're basically just habituated to the absolute absurdity of existence. And reality, you know, from my perspective, it's all Alice in Wonderland. You know, you get up in the morning and we're all down the rabbit hole and everything is absurd. But when you're in the rabbit hole, we've habituated to it. You know, we are the frog in the saucepan, and the temperature has been turned up very slowly, and we haven't noticed that everything is crazy, crackers, mental.
And on that note, let's pause on this one. I think you're right. You know, we've talked about other things we're going to talk about: love, morality, ethics, ego was in there. I think something about the role of ego in all this stuff, I think is important. So pause on that one. Pick up the next episode. I
was just going to say, if BBC Radio 4 want me for Thought for the Day, I mean, I'm available.
Absolutely.
On that note.
On that note.
Bye-bye. See you later.
Bye-bye.